The most dangerous piece of real estate on earth right now isn't Ukraine. It isn't the South China Sea. It's a narrow strip of water called the Bosphorus, and a man named Erdogan controls every ship that moves through it. Think about what that actually means. Turkey sits at the crossroads of two continents inside NATO's tent, trading energy with Russia, selling drones to Ukraine, and now, right now in 2026, hosting NATO's most advanced radar surveillance systems while they're being repositioned away from Russia and pointed directly at Iran. The United States didn't ask Turkey to do this. Washington needed it, and Ankara delivered. That is not an accident. That is leverage, cold, calculated, and working perfectly. Turkey implemented the Montreux Convention to restrict warship access to the Black Sea Straits during the Ukraine conflict, a decision that critically limited the naval forces Russia could move into the theater. Moscow never forgave that. And yet, despite opposing aims in Syria and Libya, Turkey still enjoys close energy and trade ties with Russia and Erdogan with Putin. That contradiction, that impossible balancing act, is exactly the point. Turkey will benefit from continued good relations with the US, Ukraine, and Russia, positioning Ankara to largely avoid the risk of a widening war while every other NATO member bleeds resources and nerves. This isn't confusion. This isn't weakness. This is a masterclass in 21st century power. And Washington is only now beginning to grasp what Ankara has been building for years. Russia isn't just frustrated. Russia is strategically isolated, stranded between a NATO it can't crack and a Turkey it can't control. And that, my friends, changes everything. So let's go back to the beginning, not the beginning of this war, not even the beginning of this decade, but the beginning of a much longer story. Because what Turkey is doing right now in 2026 did not happen overnight. It was decades in the making. And to understand why Washington is genuinely stunned, why Russia is strategically cornered, and why Ankara is quietly becoming one of the most powerful diplomatic forces on the planet, you have to understand where Turkey came from, what it was willing to risk, and what it calculated that nobody else saw coming. Turkey joined NATO back in 1952, and it didn't join because it was invited to a nice dinner and handed a membership card. It joined because it sent thousands of its sons to die in the Korean War fighting alongside American troops, proving to Washington and Brussels that it was serious. That was the price of admission. And in return, NATO handed Turkey the most important strategic real estate in the entire alliance, the southeastern flank, the door between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, the land bridge between Europe and Asia, the choke point through which any naval power needs to pass if it wants to project force across that entire theater. Turkey didn't just join a military alliance, it became the hinge of it. Now, fast forward to the present moment, and here's where it gets fascinating, because every single Western expert, every think tank in Washington, every foreign policy columnist, they've spent the last several years wringing their hands and asking the same anxious question. Whose side is Turkey actually on? Is Erdogan drifting toward Russia? Is he undermining NATO from the inside? Did he go too far when he bought those Russian S-400 missile systems? The nervous energy in Brussels was palpable. The frustration in Washington was real. And you know what? That anxiety was completely understandable because on the surface, Turkey looked like it was hedging, looked like it was playing both sides, looked like a liability, but that reading missed the entire point because what Turkey was actually doing and what we can only fully see clearly now in 2026 was building leverage. Extraordinary, unprecedented, once in a generation leverage. Think about how the S-400 situation played out in hindsight. Erdogan bought Russian missile defense systems, knowing full well it would get Turkey thrown out of the F-35 program. Washington was furious. NATO allies were bewildered. And on paper, it looked like a catastrophic diplomatic miscalculation. But then something happened. In the summer of 2025, Russia actually offered to buy back the S-400 systems, which tells you everything you need to know about who ended up holding the cards in that deal. Turkey had a Russian weapon system sitting in storage, acting as a perpetual negotiating chip, keeping both Moscow and Washington at the table, competing for Ankara's goodwill. That's not incompetence. That's strategy of the highest order. And it's the kind of strategy that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger would have deeply admired: cold, patient, and ruthlessly effective. And then came Ukraine, February 2022. Russia rolls across the border in what Putin thought would be a 3-day special military operation. And suddenly the entire world needed to know where Turkey stood. Erdogan made his position clear almost immediately, but he made it clear in a way that Washington didn't expect and Moscow couldn't ignore. Ankara played a critical role in supporting Ukraine, supplying military aid, and upholding the Montreux Convention, which restricts Russian naval movement. That single decision, enforcing the Montreux Convention to prevent Russian warships from reinforcing their Black Sea fleet, was one of the most consequential military decisions of the entire war. Think about what that meant in practical terms. Russia's navy could not freely move combat ships in and out of the Black Sea during active conflict. They were bottled up. They were operating inside a body of water with a NATO ally controlling the exit. For any naval strategist, that is a nightmare scenario, and Turkey made it reality by simply enforcing a 1936 treaty. No guns fired, no troops deployed, just legal authority applied at exactly the right moment. But while Turkey was upholding that convention for NATO's benefit, it was simultaneously refusing to join Western sanctions on Russia. Ankara resisted Western pressure to impose personal or sectoral sanctions on Russia. Large numbers of Russians sought sanctuary in Turkey. Meanwhile, Turkish exports to Russia more than quadrupled in the year following February 2022, before dropping under sustained US and European pressure, including the threat of secondary sanctions. Now, a surface level reading of that says Turkey is being duplicitous. It says Ankara is profiteering from both sides of a bloody war. But a deeper reading, the kind that actually predicts what happens next, says something far more interesting. Turkey was keeping Russia economically breathing while militarily suffocating. They were keeping Moscow dependent on Ankara as an economic lifeline while simultaneously degrading Russia's military position. That dual squeeze, economic dependency combined with military isolation, is the kind of geopolitical pressure that empires used to dream about. Turkey was doing it in real time, in the middle of the biggest war in Europe since 1945, while half of Washington was still arguing about whether Erdogan could be trusted. And then there are the drones. Let's talk about the drones, because the Bayraktar TB2 is one of the most important weapon systems in modern military history, and almost nobody in America talked about it seriously until it was already reshaping the battlefield. When no Western country, not the United States, not France, not Germany, not Israel, was willing to sell Ukraine armed unmanned aerial vehicles before the 2022 invasion, Turkey sold them. Countries like the US, China, and Israel denied selling Ukraine armed UAVs. Turkey was the only country to accept selling Ukraine this technology. That decision, made years before the war began, wasn't charity. It was foresight. It was Turkey betting that Ukraine would matter, that the Black Sea theater would be decisive, and that whoever armed Ukraine's defenses early would earn a lasting strategic relationship with Kyiv, with Washington, and with the broader NATO alliance. And they were right. In the initial stages of the war, the Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 UAV captured world attention by destroying Russian armor and supply columns. The videos went viral globally. The drone became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance, a Turkish drone flying over a NATO-bordered conflict, destroying Russian armor, and the song Ukrainians wrote about the Bayraktar became an international sensation, sung in multiple languages, played at rallies across Europe. Turkey had put its technology, its brand, and its name on the right side of history, And it did so while simultaneously maintaining gas pipelines to Russia and tourist relationships with Moscow. That is the kind of tightrope act that would make most governments collapse under the contradiction. Erdogan turned it into a permanent power position. Now let's talk about what makes 2026 genuinely historic. Because what is happening this year is not incremental. It is a structural shift in global power architecture, and Turkey is at the center of it. The 2026 Ankara summit is a future meeting of heads of state and government of NATO member states, scheduled to be held in Ankara, Turkey on 7th or 8th July 2026. It will be the 36th NATO summit. Stop and think about what that means. The most powerful military alliance in human history, 32 nations, a combined GDP larger than every other economy on earth, is meeting on Turkish soil in Erdogan's capital city at his presidential palace. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte didn't just announce the venue. Erdogan and Rutte agreed on close coordination and Turkey's key role in the Ukraine peace process as one of NATO's most important members. And the two leaders also underscored Ankara's important role in Black Sea security, NATO's most important member. That's not a translation error. That's not diplomatic flattery. That's the institutional acknowledgement of a reality that has been building for years. Turkey is not a problem member of NATO that needs to be managed. Turkey is the indispensable member that defines NATO's relevance in the most contested part of the world. And what's Russia's position as all of this unfolds? Stranded is actually the right word, and it's worth sitting with that word for a moment because it captures something precise. Russia is not defeated. Russia is not collapsing. But Russia is strategically isolated in a way that is genuinely unprecedented, and Turkey is one of the primary architects of that isolation. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said that more investment and military equipment are needed to deal with the threat posed by Russia and terrorism, but also by China, which has become the focus of US concern. Russia reconstituting its forces within 3 to 5 years after Ukraine was the warning. But the deeper problem for Moscow is not the military attrition, it's the geopolitical encirclement, and Turkey tightens that encirclement every single time it makes another move in this incredible multi-decade chess game. Consider what Turkey has done to Russia's energy strategy, specifically because this is an area that most American media completely ignores, and it is absolutely central to understanding Russia's predicament. After Germany shut down Nord Stream and the European energy market fractured, Russia needed alternate routes to maintain its revenue streams. After Nord Stream was disabled, Russian gas continued to enter Europe via Turk Stream, Russian molecules generating revenues under Turkish invoices. Think about what that sentence means. The pipeline through which Russia earns money to fund its war machine runs through Turkey. Turkey collects fees on it. Turkey controls the valve. That means Ankara holds the economic lifeline to Moscow in one hand and the military alliance confronting Moscow in the other hand. Russia cannot cut Turkey off without bleeding itself dry, and Turkey cannot fully align with NATO's maximalist position against Russia without losing its single greatest source of economic leverage over the Kremlin. This is not a bug in Turkey's foreign policy. This is the entire design. Strategic ambiguity is not confusion, it is a weapon, and Turkey has wielded it with extraordinary precision. Now, there's something else happening in 2026 that deserves serious attention, and it's getting almost no coverage in American media. On July 1st, 2025, Turkey assumed command of the NATO Allied Reaction Force, Amphibious Task Force Command, and the Landing Force Command, marking a historic achievement for the country within the alliance. This one-year leadership role put Turkey at the operational helm of significant NATO forces, not just an advisory role, not just a diplomatic presence, but actual command authority over NATO's rapid deployment capability. Turkey commanding NATO's reaction forces while simultaneously hosting the 2026 summit, while simultaneously brokering peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, while simultaneously building the next generation of combat drones that NATO allies are lining up to purchase. That is not the profile of an unreliable ally. That is the profile of a rising power that has figured out how to make itself indispensable to every side of every major conflict simultaneously. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle Moscow. When Turkey commands NATO forces, that's not symbolic. That means Turkish officers are coordinating with American, British, French, German, and Polish counterparts at levels of operational integration that no amount of diplomatic courtship from Putin can disrupt. The institutional roots go deep. The interoperability runs through every communication system, every logistics chain, every targeting protocol. Russia cannot compete with that kind of structural embeddedness, and it knows it. Let's step back for a moment and think about what this looks like from Washington's perspective, because the United States is genuinely in a complicated position here. On one hand, Turkey is doing things that American strategists have wanted for years, maintaining pressure on Russia in the Black Sea, arming Ukraine, hosting NATO's command structure, building a defense industry that actually reduces the alliance's dependency on American hardware, and managing the diplomatic relationship with Moscow so that there is always a back channel available when Washington needs one. On the other hand, Turkey is doing things that make the State Department deeply uncomfortable, maintaining economic relationships with Russia in defiance of sanctions pressure, cracking down on domestic opposition, arresting the mayor of Istanbul, and pursuing an increasingly assertive regional foreign policy that doesn't always check with Washington first. Turkey in 2025 is NATO's indispensable irritant, too valuable to alienate, too erratic to fully trust. That description captures the Washington-Ankara dynamic with remarkable accuracy. But notice which word comes first: indispensable, not irritant, indispensable. The irritant part is manageable, the indispensable part is structural, and Washington knows it. The Atlantic Council, which is probably the most influential foreign policy think tank in Washington when it comes to NATO affairs, published an analysis this year arguing something that would have seemed almost absurd just 5 years ago. By encouraging Turkey to change its current prohibitions on large-scale traffic of US LNG through the Bosphorus Strait, US President Donald Trump can extend Western economic and strategic presence into one of the most contested theaters of the conflict. Read that again carefully. American strategists are now writing policy papers about how to ask Turkey for permission to move American energy through Turkish waters to counter Russian influence. That is the new reality. That is how far Turkey has moved the needle. The United States, the most powerful country in the history of the world, is now strategizing about how to persuade Erdogan to open a gate that he controls, not forcing it open, not circumventing it, persuading him with a deal that benefits Turkey. That shift in the power dynamic is enormous, and most Americans watching the news have no idea it happened. And what about the drone revolution that Turkey is still very much driving? Because this story isn't finished. Turkey didn't just build the Bayraktar TB2 and call it a day. Turkey's unmanned fighter, Bayraktar Kızılelma, became the first drone in the world to strike a jet from long range in a successful test over the Black Sea. The world's first drone to successfully fire an air-to-air missile with radar guidance and hit an aerial target. Not an American system, not a Chinese system. A Turkish system built by a private Turkish company, with Kızılelma entering mass production and delivery to the Turkish Armed Forces planned for 2026. Meanwhile, Turkey's Khan fighter jet is being developed as a fifth-generation stealth aircraft. US Ambassador Tom Barrack put it bluntly when he said the Khan costs around $100 million compared to the F-35's $85 million, and suggested the F-35 may eventually be obsolete. An American ambassador saying that a Turkish fighter jet might make America's most expensive weapons program look dated. That is a statement that deserves to be heard loudly and clearly in Washington. Turkey is not just a security consumer inside NATO anymore. It is becoming a security producer, and that changes the entire negotiating dynamic with every partner and every adversary simultaneously. Baker stated that 90% of its 2024 revenues, or USD 1.8 billion, had been generated from exports. So far, the Bayraktar TB2 and Bayraktar Akıncı UAVs have been delivered to 35 countries in total, with the TB2 entering the inventories of 34, including 6 NATO allies and 4 EU member states. 6 NATO allies are now flying Turkish drones. Think about what that means for the geopolitical ecosystem inside the alliance. Poland is flying Bayraktars. Romania is flying Bayraktars. Albania and Croatia too. These are countries on NATO's eastern flank, directly adjacent to Russia and Belarus, armed with Turkish-made precision strike systems. Turkey's defense industry is literally equipping the front line of the alliance that most directly threatens Moscow. And every purchase contract, every maintenance agreement, every pilot trained by Turkish instructors deepens Ankara's relationship with those NATO capitals while simultaneously building Turkey's own industrial base and export revenue. It's genius, actually. Turkey is monetizing the threat from Russia, turning Moscow's aggression into a business opportunity that simultaneously strengthens NATO's eastern flank and Turkey's own strategic position. Russia is funding the arms build-up against itself by forcing the threat environment that makes Bayraktar drones commercially attractive. That is a level of strategic irony that history rarely produces. Now let's talk about the peace process dimension, because this is where Turkey's role becomes even more extraordinary and even less understood by the American public. Turkey also hosted ceasefire negotiations initiated by the Trump administration in early 2025, Russia and Ukraine at the same table in Turkey, with Erdogan playing host and intermediary, while Turkish drones are still being used against Russian forces in the Black Sea theater, while Turkish companies are technically still processing Russian gas through Turk Stream. While Turkish diplomats are talking to Washington, Moscow, and Kyiv in the same week, no other country on earth could hold that position simultaneously. Not France, not Germany, not India, not China, only Turkey. And the reason Turkey can do it is precisely because of all those years of strategic ambiguity that drove Western analysts crazy. All those years of refusing to fully commit, refusing to be fully boxed in, refusing to let any single alliance relationship define the totality of Turkish foreign policy. Since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, Ankara has acted simultaneously as mediator and disruptor, brokering the Black Sea Grain Initiative and prisoner exchanges while refusing full alignment with Western sanctions on Russia. The Black Sea Grain Initiative was Turkey's achievement. It kept Ukrainian and Russian grain moving through the Black Sea to feed over 100 countries, many of them in Africa and the Middle East, during the most dangerous period of the war. NATO couldn't do it. The UN couldn't do it. The United States couldn't do it. Turkey did it. And when that initiative eventually collapsed under Russian pressure, it was Turkey that was still at the table, still the only party that both sides trusted enough to talk through, still the indispensable intermediary. In contrast to its Western neighbors, Turkey will benefit from continued good relations with the US, Ukraine, and Russia, which will position Ankara to largely avoid the risk of a widening war. Turkey, the Eurasia Group concluded, is the exception to every rule that is causing pain across the Western world in 2026. Every other NATO member is facing budget pressure, political instability, and strategic anxiety about what happens if America pulls back. Turkey is thriving, expanding, and becoming more central to every conversation that matters. And here's the final piece of this picture that I want you to hold in your mind, because it speaks to something much deeper than military strategy or energy economics. It speaks to the question of what power actually looks like in the 21st century. The old model of power was simple. You had the biggest military, the strongest economy, and the most alliances, and that made you dominant. The United States built the entire post-war order around that model, and it worked for decades. But the world has shifted. We live now in what scholars call a multipolar moment, a moment where no single country can simply impose its will on the global system, where every major issue requires coalition building, where the most valuable asset any country can have is not raw power, but positioning. The ability to talk to everyone, the ability to make yourself necessary to every side, the ability to occupy the hinge point, the place where all the competing forces have to pass through. Turkey has that positioning. For Black Sea security, the most likely 2026 trajectory is sustained volatility with episodic spikes. If there is a ceasefire, priorities shift to verification, mine clearance, and protected shipping corridors, where regional NATO littoral cooperation can scale up. Across scenarios, Ankara's success will depend on crisis communication with allies. In every scenario, war continuing, ceasefire achieved, escalation occurring, Turkey is central. There is no Black Sea security architecture that works without Ankara. There is no Ukraine peace process that holds without Turkey as guarantor. There is no NATO southern flank that functions without Turkey's military mass and geographic position. And there is no economic pressure campaign against Russia that reaches its full potential without Turkey deciding how far it wants to open or close the economic valve it controls through Turkstream and its trading relationships with Moscow. Russia understands this, and Russia is deeply uncomfortable with it. Moscow spent years trying to pull Turkey away from NATO, offering energy deals, weapons sales, diplomatic partnerships, tourist revenues, and personal courtship between Putin and Erdogan. And Turkey took all of those offerings, pocketed them as leverage, and then used that leverage to deepen its position inside NATO rather than drift away from it. Putin thought he was buying Turkish neutrality. He was actually funding Turkish power. That is the miscalculation at the heart of Russia's strategic isolation in 2026. Moscow spent 20 years trying to create a wedge between Turkey and the West. Instead, it created the conditions under which Turkey became the most powerful middle power in the world, simultaneously embedded in NATO's core command structure, trusted by Ukraine as a weapons partner and peace broker, economically intertwined with Russia, building a defense industry that rivals American and Chinese platforms, and hosting the next NATO summit in its capital city. Russia thought it was playing chess. Turkey was playing a completely different game. And now, as the pieces settle across the board in 2026, Moscow looks around and finds itself not defeated, not conquered, but hemmed in from every direction, with the key to its survival running through the one country that it can neither control nor afford to lose. That's what stranded looks like in the 21st century. Not a military defeat, a strategic condition, and Turkey built it brick by brick, decision by decision, across 30 years of patient, deliberate, underestimated power.